I have great pleasure first in introducing Gabriel Rockhill, founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop, or the Atelier de Théorie Critique, who is professor of philosophy at Villanova University and the author or editor of 9 books, as well as numerous scholarly and public articles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. It is a pleasure to be part of this panel with so many of the leading intellectuals who have worked on fascism and from whom I've learned an enormous amount. It's also a pleasure to collaborate insofar as I'm the director of the Critical Theory Workshop with the IMG. I look forward to other collaborations like this in the future, and I'll share in the chat after my comments the call for applications for our summer school. My comments today are entitled Fascism, the Cutting Edge of Imperialism. In order to understand how fascism operates as a form of political management under capitalism, it is essential to undertake a dialectical analysis of the relationship between fascist ideologies and the economic base. The definition proposed in the theses of the 13th Executive Committee of the Communist International Plenum of December 1933 and made famous by George Dimitrov is perfectly in line with this orientation. Quote, "Fascism is the open, terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital," end quote. We see here a clear-eyed understanding of how fascism, far from simply being a set of morally reprehensible ideas or actions, is ultimately grounded in imperialism. Driven by the economic base and funded by the most reactionary elements of the capitalist ruling class, fascism often seeks to mobilize certain sectors of the civilian population, primarily the petty bourgeoisie and the lumpen proletariat, and state forces in a process of national renewal via the intensification of imperialism and the radicalization of capitalism's colonial legacy. In the interwar period, it was characterized, among other things, by the violent expansion of imperialism on the part of the European latecomers to the colonial feast, Italy and Germany, as well as the imperial emergence of Japan in the East. I'm going to share with you my intertitles just to mark where we're headed. So, interwar fascism and imperialism. Italy, in order to secure access to cheap natural resources and labor pools, as well as markets, undertook a project of imperial expansion. By the outbreak of the First World War, it had already annexed Eritrea and Somalia, and it had wrested control of regions like modern-day Libya away from the Ottoman Empire. Mussolini's government undertook to increase the size of the Italian Empire, which it did by continuing to expand the borders of its colonies and forcibly seizing Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and modern-day Albania. This process continued at the outbreak of the Second World War with fascist Italy's invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. In the East, the Empire of the Rising Sun annexed various Manchuria and various regions in China, and it also took over Taiwan and turned Korea into a colony. Japan continued to expand its empire across Southeast Asia through the onset of the Second World War. The Nazi expansion across Europe is well known, but it is less widely acknowledged that its colonial undertaking in the East against the Soviet Union was modeled on the US's settler colonial project and its expansion to the West. Just as the United States had genocidally eliminated the indigenous population and sequestered survivors on reservations, Nazi Germany planned to use what it had learned about the dark arts of genocide in Europe against the Slavs in the East. According to Mika Dorom's 1965 documentary film, Triumph Over Violence, the 6 million sent to gas chambers in Europe was the warm-up routine for what was to be the elimination of 60 million people across the Soviet Union. The Nazis' imperial drive was not only for Lebensraum in the East, it was also, crucially, to eliminate the greatest enemy of imperialism, actually existing socialism. This, of course, is one of the major reasons why major segments of the capitalist ruling class financially backed Hitler. I'll reference Jack Powell's excellent book on this topic since he's on the call, and we'll hear from him shortly. Next section, defeat and redeployment. One of the greatest ironies of the 20th century was that bourgeois democracies like those in the United Kingdom and the United States were compelled to ally with the Reds in the USSR in order to fend off Germany's bid to become the leading imperialist power by engulfing the former world leaders in imperialism, as well as Japan's attempt in the East to wrest control away from the West. It was the Reds who ultimately defeated the fascists, and all anti-fascists have an enormous debt to the 27 million Soviets and the 20 million Chinese who gave their Fascism, we should never forget, was ultimately defeated by communism, since the heart of the Second World War was fought in the East. With the routing of Germany, Italy, and Japan, as well as the destruction of the former imperialist powers in Western Europe, the US emerged as the new leader of the imperialist camp. While its cultural apparatus projected an image of it as the leader of the free world, its national security state discreetly set about integrating fascists from around the world into a veritable imperialist international. To cite but a few revealing examples, the head of the Nazi intelligence service directed against the Soviets, Reinhard Gehlen, was recruited by the OSS and then continued under the CIA after the war, and then put in charge of the West German intelligence service, where he proceeded to hire thousands of his fellow Nazis. Yvanik Donuel explained this strategy with remarkable clarity. Quote, "It is hard to understand that as early as 1945, the Army and the US intelligence services recruited without qualms former Nazi criminals. The equation was, however, very simple at the time. The United States had just defeated the Nazis with the help of the Soviets. They henceforth planned to defeat the Soviets with the help of former Nazis," end quote. This included bringing 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States in Operation Paperclip, providing safe passage for some 10,000 other Nazis to the United States, stocking stay-behind armies across Europe with Nazis and Italian fascists in Operation Gladio, and running many through rat lines to Latin America to support US-backed dictatorships across the region. I've detailed this in a long article on the topic if anyone wants additional references in that regard. The same basic pattern that we saw in Nazi Germany is also visible in Italy, as attested to by Operation Sunrise and the CIA's recruitment of figures like the Black Prince, Valerio Borghese, to continue the fascist war on communism. In the case of Imperial Japan, its leaders were largely put right back in power by the United States. As the undisputed overseer of global imperialism, the US enlisted this international network of right-wing militants in its ongoing war on communism and its efforts to expand its imperium through the proliferation of dirty wars, terrorist and torture campaigns, concentration camps, and dictatorial regimes around the world. Victor Marchetti, a senior CIA official from 1955 to 1969, described the centrality of fascists to empire building in the following terms, quote, "We," meaning the CIA, "were supporting every half-assed dictator, military junta, oligarchy that existed in the Third World, as long as they promised to somehow maintain the status quo, which would of course be beneficial to US geopolitical interests, military interests, big business interests, and other special interests," end quote. The contemporary cutting edge of imperialism. Fascism has, at least in a certain sense, served as the cutting edge of imperialism, meaning the frontline struggle to expand empire and beat back socialist resistance, often through violent forms of so-called primitive accumulation, form of political management, when the drive for endless expansion encounters limits or threats thereof, including its own systemic crises of realization, socialism, and the power of organized labor. With this in mind, let us briefly consider two contemporary conflicts in order to see what light this insight can shed on them: Ukraine and Israel. According to the bourgeois concept of fascism, which dominates the mainstream media, neither of these could be considered fascist, either for culturalist reasons or because they maintain a semblance of bourgeois democracy as hollowed out as it is. In the case of Ukraine, liberals often assert that it cannot, because of President Zelensky's Jewish heritage. They thereby confuse the specific of certain fascist ideologies, anti-Semitism, with the universal form of fascism. However, fascism can have very different ideological contents depending on the circumstances, and these should not distract us from its general form. In the case of Ukraine, we have a government that has worked hand in glove with fascist militias that explicitly identify with the Banderite tradition of Nazi collaboration. These militias have played a key role in fighting the Russian separatists in the Donbass, who declared nation in reaction to the 2014 fascist Maidan coup fomented by the United States. In its ongoing efforts to quash this anti-fascist movement, the Zelensky government has banned political parties, thrown opposition leaders and communists in prison, control of the media, worked closely with fascist militias and integrated some of their forces into the National Guard, glorified ultranationalists and Nazi collaborators, empowered of fascism, and postponed elections. The primary force propelling the Donbass region and Russia is above and beyond Ukrainian oligarchs like Ihor Kolomoisky, the United States, which is using Ukraine as a proxy in its war against Russia and ultimately China. Although Russia is, of course, a capitalist country, it has pursued an autonomous path as of late, refusing to follow the dictates of the US imperium and instead asserting an agenda of national development, along with foreign policy interests that conflict with Washington. This means, in short, that it has created a number of obstacles to the development of US imperialism. In this regard, the fascist developments in Ukraine, in its war against Russia, can be seen as part of an attempt to expand imperialism and beat back oppositional forces. It is precisely because the US has branded its imperial expansion as the spread of democracy that the very idea that fascism might be at work in Ukraine has been mainstream Western media. Regarding Israel, it might be fascist or that fascist elements could be operative in the country is often considered in the West to be a logical impossibility because it is a Jewish state. The specific content of fascist ideologies varies considerably, however, and anti-Semitism or white supremacy, to take but two examples, are not requirements. In fact, these are only specific types of dehumanization, but there are plenty of others for different target populations. It is helpful in this regard to invoke Domenico Losordo's important distinction between naturalistic despecification and moral or political despecification. Both of these processes occur in moments of acute crisis. They involve, Losordo explained, the exclusion or expulsion of particular ethnic, social, or political groups from the valued community, the properly civilized group, even the human race, end quote. Despecificazione in Italian has the connotation of an exclusion from the species. The Third Reich, identifying its enemy as an entire race or people, relied on naturalistic despecification, which dominated the colonial tradition that it sought to resume and radicalize. In the Soviet Union, by contrast, quoting Losordo, despecification was invariably political, moral, not racial. Forced labor was not a hereditary condition, end quote. Exclusion from the community was based on moral and political choices, not purportedly unchangeable natural characteristics like race, religion, nationality, or ethnicity. Given what I briefly outlined, and I'm going to shortly conclude, or soon conclude, regarding fascism's roots in the colonial project of expansion and the role it has often played as the cutting edge of imperialism, it is worth recalling that the Zionist movement that eventually led to the founding of Israel was explicitly conceived of as a colonial project. Theodore Herzl, the movement's preeminent leader, liaised with the racist symbol of British colonialism, Cecil Rhodes, about quote unquote, something colonial, namely his project to use religion as a real estate deed to dispossess Palestinians. The Zionists received extensive backing by major forces in finance capital like the Rothschild oil and banking interests, and they secured the support of major imperialist powers. In return for their backing, they were guaranteed that the new state would serve their interests. Given Israel's geostrategic location and proximity to major oil and gas reserves, it was of great importance to the leading imperialist countries, and it also served as a geostrategic wedge against pan-Arab socialism. If we look at Israel's current assault on Gaza and the positions taken by the Israeli government, it is imperative to ask a question that has largely been excluded from mainstream Western media accounts. Is this a case of naturalistic despecification as a justification for colonial? The Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, has stated, quote, "It is an entire that is responsible." It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not being aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. We will fight until we break their backbone, end quote. The failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians is a war crime, according to international law. Nevertheless, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered a complete siege of Gaza in a clear act of collective punishment. Quote, "No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything will be closed. We are fighting against human animals," end quote. Israeli army reservist Ezra Yachin understood his government's position perfectly well and harangued his fellow soldiers to, quote, "erase them, their families, mothers, and children. These animals can no longer live. Every Jew with a weapon should go out and kill them. If you have an Arab neighbor, don't wait, go to his home and shoot him, end quote. Yachin, who is 95, has been touted in the Western press as Israel's oldest reservist. He has been around long enough to have had the remarkable record of having sought to ally not once, but twice with Hitler's Germany in order to have Nazi backing for his Zionist project of colonizing Palestine. As journalist Dan Cohen explained, Yachin, quote, was a member of the Lehi, the Zionist terrorist group that twice attempted to ally with Nazi Germany and sought to found a copycat fascist state, end quote. I don't have time to kind of get in and answer the question that I've raised, but it should, I think, give us all something to think about in reflecting on the relationship between fascism and imperialism in the current moment. And just to conclude, in order to understand the last century of fascism, it's imperative to situate it in relationship to imperialism. And although both of these phenomena are multifaceted, I hope it is now clear that at least one of the roles that fascism has played over the course of the last 100 years has been to serve as the cutting edge of imperialism, meaning the frontline war for its violent expansion and the beating back of socialism. It is a tool of political management under capitalism that is regularly deployed in order to subdue those populations that refuse to acquiesce to imperialism. While there are many tactics for fighting it, there is only one clear strategy, which consists in overcoming capitalism that is the driving force behind fascism and establishing socialism. Thank you very much.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.